This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Ateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories. The Chinese premier calling for global cooperation amid a shifting world order in his keynote speech at the World Economic Forum. Now, Singapore's leader echoing the sentiment at the Summer Davos, highlighting how small countries can lay the groundwork for a more stable international environment. Donald Trump gives China the all-clear to continue buying Iranian oil as a fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran holds. And NATO leaders set to sign off on a spending pledge to meet the US president's demand to spend 5% of their GDP on defense. And prosecutors seek a fresh arrest warrant for ousted South Korean President Yoon after he repeatedly failed to show up for questioning. Also at East Asia tonight, Japan successfully conducts a surface-to-ship missile test off the Pacific, citing the need to enhance its defenses, given what it calls the current severe security environment. Chinese Premier Li Qiang has expressed confidence that China's economy can maintain a relatively rapid growth rate as it seeks to shift from a manufacturing-led model to a consumer-driven one. Mr. Li made the comments during his keynote speech at the World Economic Forum meeting in Tianjin. But the Chinese premier also warns of profound changes in the global economy, an apparent swipe at US tariffs, as he calls for cooperation over protectionism. Mr. Li says the world is at a crossroads, and he urges countries to act collectively and consult equally. For more on this, CNA's Olivia Seong, she joins us live from the World Economic Forum in Tianjin, China. Olivia, the current complex global environment, how did that factor into Chinese Premier Li Qiang's speech?
Well, I'll tell you, things winding down here at the World Economic Forum in Tianjin. That's why you're hearing perhaps the music in the background. But certainly this has been a day with much to talk about. The headline being the Chinese Premier's speech, in which he spoke for half an hour at the opening plenary, but very noticeably not making any mention of the United States, nor the Trump administration's sweeping global tariffs, nor its export controls on advanced tech. But it was clear that the reference and the alluding to the Trump administration's actions on China were being made by the Chinese premier. Setting the stage, the Chinese premier said that the world has seen a substantial increase in protectionist measures and growing trade frictions across the world, contrasting that by saying that China can bring stability to the economy.
I encourage you to do more things for the greater good. I hope you will always follow the laws of the market, do what is right, champion openness and cooperation, uphold economic globalization, oppose decoupling and severing of supply chains, and call on all sides not to turn trade into a political or security issue.
Now, many we had been speaking to here said they were also looking out in that speech for the Chinese premier's assessment of the Chinese economy. And he did express confidence, saying that China would be able to maintain, quote, relatively rapid growth, also pledging to make domestic consumption a key economic driver.
We are intensifying our efforts to implement the strategy of expanding domestic demand by launching special initiatives to boost consumption. This will make China a mega-sized consumption powerhouse, on top of being a manufacturing powerhouse, and provide more market space for enterprises around the world.
I'm sure, Ollie, quite a fair bit of reaction from the participants at the World Economic Forum to the Chinese Premier's speech. Can you just share with us what some of them said?
Well, Ateli, just a short while after the Chinese Premier's speech, just off camera to my right here, we did see many of the Chinese and foreign businesses gathering, and they were meeting the Chinese Premier. This pitch by Premier Li for businesses to invest in China. The question was how it was being received, and from several economists and business leaders that I've been speaking to, they say that yes, they recognize the potential of the Chinese economy, but right now what they were hoping to see perhaps were new ideas, perhaps stronger fiscal measures that would give confidence to the private sector to invest, because they say right now perhaps one of the headwinds that China is facing is one of confidence, which has resulted because of the slump in the real estate sector, resulting in people not wanting to spend. I also spoke to Professor Danny Kwa, economics professor from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, and this was how he read the Chinese Premier's speech.
There were three messages there, I thought, that he wanted the world to get. One is that the world has changed profoundly because of geopolitics and technology. The second is there are principles that we used to have about the world that China and the world need to continue to hold on to. These are principles of multilateralism, globalization, and trade. And the third part of the message was that China is here. It is part of this world. One of the interesting things about this, that the world has changed, that there are principles, that China is here, this is a speech that might have been made 2 decades ago. It was a speech that had been made then, would have sat comfortably with everything that the world all over said. It would have sat comfortably with what Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, and other transatlantic leaders have said. The big message here is that he gave that speech in a world that's now completely different. America has retreated from its telling of multilateralism and globalization, but China says it is here for you because these are the principles that still work.
But how do you think that's going to be received? Because, as you mentioned, some of the things that the Chinese Premier said are not too different from what we've been hearing in recent times, but the context is very different. It's an increasingly volatile world, Middle East instability, trade tariffs, industrial policy has changed. How do you think that's going to be received by other parties?
I think it could potentially be misinterpreted, but China, remember, both in the speech and elsewhere, has consistently talked about win-win cooperation. He repeated, the world should not fall into thinking of itself as a zero-sum game, that we win only if you lose. Win-win cooperation is the way we will solve global problems, and win-win cooperation will expand opportunities. As you say, trade should be welcomed and not viewed as a security risk. I think that on all of this, he sounds all the right notes. I think where you say there might be danger is that China is a behemoth in the world, and no matter how carefully it negotiates its actions, it has sharp elbows, and when it moves, the rest of us do feel perturbed. I think China could do a lot to reassure the rest of us. In fact, my number one candidate for China to reassure is the United States. The United States should become used to the idea that China can continue to grow and America should not feel insecure. China can help do that. It's not done that yet, but I think that would be welcomed by everyone.
And all eyes really will be on China's economic trajectory for the second half of the year. We do know that recently authorities did announce additional measures to boost domestic consumption. And we have seen some economic indicators, retail sales figures, fixed asset investment and exports last month doing better. But economists are also saying that it is still a little bit early to tell, and whether this will actually move the needle for investors to put their money into China still remains to be seen. I'll tell you.
Well, thanks for that report. CNA's Olivia Seong reporting to us live from the World Economic Forum in Tianjin, China. But we're not done with her yet. We'll have more from Olivia later on this hour on East Asia Tonight. Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong says that countries need to work together to bring down barriers to strengthen multilateralism amid growing uncertainties worldwide. He says that is how small countries like Singapore can make a difference and lay the groundwork for a more stable global order to come. He was speaking with the World Economic Forum President Borge Brenda in Tianjin during an official visit to China. And earlier, my colleague Grace Chin spoke with CNA's Tan Si-Hui, and she explained the key themes from the special dialogue session featuring Singapore's Prime Minister.
Well, that special dialogue, it was a very packed auditorium. There were no more seats left. People were left standing. More than 100 people were attending that special dialogue. And it shows that there's keen interest in what Prime Minister Lawrence Wong had to say. So one of the key themes that he touched on was globalization. He said that even though globalization has benefited nations and countries over the last few decades with free trade and open market, there's increasing discontent when it comes to globalization, and it comes off the back of the COVID-19 pandemic and the conflicts in the Middle East as well as Europe. And so it seems to be that nationalism is replacing cooperation, and he says that this worries small countries like Singapore, and in this new landscape there will be challenges that Singapore will have to face. And so he said that Singapore's response is not to close up. In fact, he said that there needs to be a way to harness forces to bring people together, to bring down barriers and to strengthen multilateralism.
So Singapore will do our part in this endeavor, whether it's forging partnerships, updating global rules, or advancing dialogue, working together with partners like the WEF. The efforts may seem small and incremental, but if like-minded countries everywhere were to do our part, then collectively I think we can make a difference. And then step by step, hopefully we can lay the groundwork for a new and more stable global order in time to come.
Well, PM Wong was then asked, will then be a need to find a new driver of growth? Well, PM Wong says that trade will still exist. In fact, he said that even though there are recent moves towards security resilience and self-sufficiency, trade may move towards a more sustainable drive with technology driving this. Now, he was also asked about a perennial question about US-China ties and Singapore being special friends between China and the US. And he said that the question is not about whether Singapore is moving closer to either China or the US. That's not how Singapore looks at it. Instead of balancing the two superpowers, he says that Singapore will continue in a consistent and a principled manner in advancing and promoting Singapore's interests so that both sides will see Singapore as a reliable and trusted partner.
We reject zero-sum competition. We embrace engagement with not just America and China, but with other major powers. And we want all to be engaged in this region, in Southeast Asia. America is the largest investor still in Southeast Asia. China remains the largest trading partner. We want both to be actively engaged. We want other major powers to be actively engaged. And we want the region to be an open and inclusive arena where people have stakes in the region and we can all work together for shared prosperity.
Meanwhile, he was also asked about trade tariffs from the US towards Singapore, which currently Singapore faces 10% of tariffs from the US. He says that currently Singapore is engaging US officials, but it is unlikely, he believes, that US will go under 10%. He says there may be a need to accept these realities that countries like Singapore will have to work with, all the while still promoting and advancing free trade.
US President Donald Trump has said that China is free to continue buying Iranian oil while urging Beijing to purchase American crude as well. The US leader posted the comments on his Truth social platform after a ceasefire was reached between Israel and Iran. The White House was quick to clarify that the president's statement does not indicate a relaxation of US sanctions. An official added that the remarks were in reference to US efforts to prevent previous Iranian threats about closing the Strait of Hormuz, while also encouraging nations to buy American oil. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had also called on China to encourage Iran not to shut down the key waterway following Washington's attacks. China has repeatedly called for calm in the Israel-Iran conflict, but its role as peacemaker is untested so far. So here's what's at stake for Asia's top power and economy when it comes to Iran. Well, China is hungry for energy and gets half of its foreign oil from the Middle East. China is Iran's biggest oil client, buying 80 to 90% of its total oil exports. Now, all that oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and at the height of recent conflict with Israel, Iran threatened to cut off the waterway, a scenario that would have been a disastrous outcome for China's energy supply. And it's not just oil. China also wants peace for its business interests in the Middle East. Now, Beijing's signature Belt and Road Initiative has hundreds of infrastructure deals in the region, all of them vulnerable to conflict. War comes with security threats, supply chain disruptions, and higher costs across the board. Now, you see, Tehran is also a key partner in Beijing's vision of an alternative security order led by the Global South. Iran is a member of BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization led by Beijing. And it's also held all these joint drills with China and Russia in recent years. And the three countries are seen as moving closer together in a geopolitical bloc. Some analysts say that war in the Middle East may not be completely negative for China. One view is that a Washington bogged down by war could offer Beijing an edge in their superpower rivalry. China could then consolidate its gains in Asia and expand its military capabilities. All right, going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, stocks rally in Asia as a ceasefire between Israel and Iran holds, and oil claws back some of its losses. A check on the markets next. Also, China urges the AIIB to step up cross-border development funding as it points to a reduction in international investment.
There are three things I love here in Isan, Thailand. The heat.
More you pound, the spicy you get.
Okay.
เก่งมากเลย
Wow.
The music. And the people.
To Isan, to Isan, to Isan.
In Search of Heat. Tonight on CNA.
Bali's snake fruit, a pride of the land for centuries.
It's really delicious. It has a sweetness to it that isn't overpowering.
Its farming system has been honored as an important global agricultural heritage. And now, locals are finding fresh ways to protect, preserve, and reimagine the future of this fruit. Tonight on CNA.
MediaCorp has been honored as Broadcaster of the Year at the 2025 World Media Festival. From Singapore to the world, our gripping documentaries and unforgettable entertainment continue to inspire, captivate, and connect audiences across the globe. This award celebrates the passion and talent behind every story we tell. Watch the award-winning programs on demand for free on MeWatch.
Hello again, you're watching East Asia Tonight, and we've been bringing you highlights from the World Economic Forum throughout the day, but just how are the events there and around the world shaping the markets? Well, Roland Lim is here to tell us more. Roland?
I'll tell you, yes. Today was a day when the markets could actually take stock of the geopolitical events. Let's start with oil prices, which has tanked on news of the ceasefire between Iran and Israel, rose with both main contracts up more than 1% today. West Texas Intermediate doing better, 1.4 currently at 65.30 a barrel. Now, despite today's moves, prices are still down around 16% from the highs on Monday, when investors reacted to the news that the U.S. had bombed Iran. Some action in the metal space too. Palladium is actually taking over the percentage gains over platinum. Gold prices also currently unchanged at $3,325.20 an ounce, and silver is currently down 0.4%. Greater China markets ending the day in the green as traders kept watch on Premier Li Qiang's opening address at the World Economic Forum. Now, he warned that global trade tensions were intensifying and that no country can grow or prosper alone. The Shanghai Composite ending the day 1% in the green, Shenzhen doing better, 1.7, and Hang Seng Index 1.23 in the green as well. Other markets in the region somewhat muted but in positive territory. Nikkei 225 ending 0.4% higher. In Seoul, the Kospi barely changed 2,782 points. Well, that's the topics, I should say. Kospi is up 0.15%. The Chinese currency is flat at 7.173, changing hands with $1, and that's on the back of trade talks center stage at the World WEF. A report that Beijing is looking into more ways for foreign institutions to use the yuan if international confidence in the dollar continues to falter. That's also weighing on the currency. China's finance minister has called on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, to step up cross-border development funding, citing a decrease in global aid. Now, steering clear of naming the U.S., the finance minister said that slowing economic growth and lower aid funds means that developing countries face a funding gap for cross-border projects. Since taking office in January, U.S. President Donald Trump has slashed aid funding. The AIIB is holding its annual meeting from yesterday to tomorrow in Beijing. It is the bank's 10th anniversary since it first started as China's answer to the World Bank. China remains the largest contributor to the 110-member bank, holding more than a quarter of the votes. Members also elected Chinese former Vice Finance Minister Zhou Jiayi as the lender's new president. For more of this, we now join CNA's Tan Yuguan live in Shanghai. Yuguan, thanks for joining us. What can we expect from the new president, Zhou Jiayi, as the new president?
Well, perhaps you could see how she would function as a new president from her bio. She does have some similarities and differences from her predecessor, Jing Liqun. Now, Madam Zhou Jiayi comes with quite high political credentials. She is currently the Deputy Secretary General of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, or CPPCC, the country's top political advisory body, and a former Vice Finance Minister, which is also what the current president was before as well. It's the same; they both had the same positions. But unlike Jing, Zhou did not have prior experience heading international organizations. Now, Mr. Jing, the current president, was the first Chinese national to be the vice president of the Asian Development Bank in Manila, and also worked in the World Bank in Washington. As for Madam Zhou, she represented China at the World Bank, the the Asian Development Bank, and the AIIB. And that has become a bugbear for AIIB's most vocal critic, AIIB's former global comms chief, Bob Picard. Now, Mr. Picard quit the bank, complaining of the toxic culture dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. He claims that Zhou's background shows no positions with political independence, and the nomination shows that Beijing is dropping any pretense that the bank is independent. That said, Zhou is not without her fans. Cai Ting recently cited AIIB's chief economist, Eric Berkloff, from Sweden, as saying that Zhou is the candidate he most looks forward to seeing as the next president. The same outlet also says that the 61-year-old has long been regarded as the preferred choice by many within the bank and the international, and also by international financial and diplomatic circles. She also has experience as a commissioner of China's anti-corruption agency, an experience that could come in handy in working on projects in developing countries where institutions are weak and the lure of corruption could be strong. Roland?
Yuan, the Chinese finance minister also called on the AIIB to step up funding as the U.S. cuts its aid funding. What more can you tell us about his speech?
Well, the Chinese finance minister, Lan Fo'an, was actually called on the lender to increase its support for emerging markets, and he was saying that while speaking to the AIIB annual meeting in Beijing. He says, and I quote, global economic growth is slowing and international development and aid funds are declining, and developing countries constrained by limited public resources commonly face a funding gap for cross-border connectivity investments. In his words, China looks forward to the AIIB demonstrating greater intensity in rolling out more measures to mobilize additional resources in support of cross-border connectivity. He also called on private firms to increase their involvement in such projects. There's, of course, an element of self-interest here for China, given the tense relations with trade relations with the U.S. China has been actively courting developing countries as markets for its products, and therefore better connectivity in these countries would help in that effort. Roland?
Thanks, Yuan. There was Tan Yuan reporting to us live from Shanghai. And that'll do it for business at this hour, for now, anyway.
For now, because you will be coming back, Roland. Don't forget about that. We'll be chatting a little bit more later, perhaps, about oil prices. On that note, we're going to go for a short break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight. Extreme weather in China as tens of thousands flee flooded villages in the southwest. The capital and other provinces swelter in a heat wave. And South Korean prosecutors find fresh ground to seek the arrest of former President Yoon Suk-yeol.
The weather brought to you by Trafalgar. Unlock the best of Europe and beyond. Visit Trafalgar.com.
What was that? I can see its hand. Oh my God. Hold. You hold the position. Ah, my knee is cramping up.
This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. China calls for global cooperation as trade tensions intensify. He says countries must oppose decoupling and choose multilateralism over protectionism. Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong making the same call at the World Economic Forum in Tianjin, China. He says global rules and institutions are weakening and lagging today's economy. Mr. Wong called for flexible multilateralism and cooperation to build a more stable global order. And US President Donald Trump gives the go-ahead for China to keep buying oil from Iran, but Washington clarifies sanctions on Tehran remain in place. Now, NATO leaders at The Hague are ready to ink a deal to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP. Bloc Chief Mark Rutte striking a conciliatory tone with the US President Donald Trump. The speculation swells around Washington's commitment to mutual defense.
For too long, one ally, the United States, carried too much of the burden of that commitment. And that changes today. President Trump, dear Donald, you made this change possible. Your leadership on this has already produced $1 trillion in extra spending from European allies since 2016. And the decisions today will produce trillions more for our common defense to make us stronger and fairer by equalizing spending between America and America's allies.
President Trump has said NATO countries should hit the new threshold, which is well beyond the current 2% baseline level. Members of the alliance have agreed on 5%, with Spain as the only holdout.
With them all the way. I mean, if you take a look at the numbers, we're with them, and they have very big things to announce today. I don't know if you've taken the vote or you're going to take the vote, but I've been asking them to go up to 5% for a number of years, and they're going up to 5%.
And for more, Ross Cullen, he joins us live from The Hague in the Netherlands. So, Ross, the NATO chief there appearing pretty optimistic about the pact, even praising a U.S. leader for making the summit happen. So this display of unity, how do you think that impacts the final decision?
Yeah, I tell you, that's right. They're hoping to get this final decision approved on national countries, members of the alliance, agreeing to raise the percentage of GDP that is allocated towards defence to 5%, roughly broken down into 3.5% on core military operations like weapons and troops, and 1.5% on defence-related activities like boosting industrial capacity, defence infrastructure, and so on. So they're hoping to get that agreement signed, but there will be careful wording to be able to accommodate Spain's position, as you mentioned in the introduction, wanting to diverge away from agreeing to 5%. Also, the timelines. Will countries have 5 years to do this, 10 years, or even longer to be able to adjust their national budgets to incorporate this change in how much money they're going to be spending on defence? But overall, that is a broad agreement from people like Mark Rutte, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer as well, that Europe needs to be doing more to pay for Europe's defence. So they have that agreement. There's also been, for Donald Trump, they've tried to keep this summit short as well. It's a concentrated summit, just mainly focusing on this Wednesday morning local time. That is when the only plenary session is happening, with all the leaders of the different NATO members, and then it will be breaking up around lunchtime, because they didn't want to risk a repeat of what happened during the G7 summit in Canada earlier this month, when Donald Trump did leave early.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned it is a concentrated summit, but have members had the time to actually weigh in on the whole Israel-Iran conflict, and what is the sentiment on that front?
Well, certainly one of the members who weighed in on that issue was the US President himself, speaking before attending the plenary session with other leaders. He doubled down on his criticism of US media outlets who've been reporting a leak of intelligence from the Pentagon suggesting that the impact of the United States' strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities on Saturday over the weekend, in fact, only put Iran's nuclear capacity back by months, did not, to use the president's terms, completely obliterate Iran's nuclear program. He doubled down on that, calling several outlets, including CNN, MSNBC and the New York Times, quote, scum. So real tough criticism from the United States president, but they have admitted this leak has taken place and they're going to be looking into that. So there is this overshadowing of Iran. Israel, Mark Rutte did mention that he was pleased with just how much work the US president had put in to try to bring about this ceasefire between the two countries. So there is that issue as well. And of course, Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is here in person as well, having a one-on-one during the day with Donald Trump as well. So there is the war in Ukraine, which is one of the key focuses, has always been for NATO over the last few years. But there is the overshadowing as well of the Iran-Israel conflict. Ateli.
Hey, thanks so much for that report. Ross Cullen, live from The Hague. Japan has conducted its first surface-to-ship missile test on home soil as the country boosts its military capacity in the region. Now, the military described the test as successful and plans to hold another this week. The test was carried out from a training ground in Hokkaido towards Pacific waters. Tokyo says that the exercise is not aimed at any specific nation, though it has previously called neighboring China its greatest security challenge. Japan usually holds such missile drills in the US and Australia due to space and safety constraints.
このような国内における実射訓練は、より多くの部隊の訓練機会の確保につながるものであり、厳しい安全保障環境の中、島しょ部などの防衛に必要な能力の維持・向上のために極めて重要であると考えております。
South Korean prosecutors have filed a fresh request for an arrest warrant against former President Yoon Suk-yeol after he repeatedly failed to appear for questioning. Well, Yoon is under investigation for alleged insurrection tied to a failed attempt to impose martial law during his presidency. A special counsel appointed by Parliament this month is leading the probe. Yoon has refused to comply despite multiple summons, prompting the special counsel to include charges of obstruction of official duties. Now, prosecutors have also requested the Justice Ministry to reimpose a travel ban. Yoon did attend a hearing on Monday where he defended his actions. He said that the proposed martial law was intended to send a strong message to the public using a minimal number of personnel and unarmed soldiers. His next court appearance is scheduled for 3rd of July. And more than 80,000 people have been forced out of their homes as severe floods engulfed the southwestern Chinese province of Guizhou. Villages were inundated and a bridge collapsed in the mountainous region. Residents in vulnerable communities have also been advised to seek refuge on higher grounds after multiple rivers burst their banks following days of rain. Rescuers have also been pushing boats carrying residents through murky knee-high water. More rain is forecast in the coming days. Authorities warn Guizhou and other provinces should be on guard. In contrast, capital Beijing, Henan, Shandong and Hebei are sweltering in temperatures close to 40 degrees Celsius. Earlier this week, authorities in Beijing issued the second highest heat warning for the capital on one of the hottest days of the year so far. Breaks up next, but coming up on East Asia tonight, more analysis from experts at the World Economic Forum in Tianjin on what to expect from Donald Trump's trade policies and how this would impact China and the rest of the world. China's gaming regulator grants licenses for new games, pushing up stocks in Hong Kong.
There are three things I love here in Isan, Thailand. The heat.
More you pound, the spicy you get.
More pepper.
Oh,
เก่งมากเลย
The music and the people. In Search of Heat, tonight on CNA.
The first thing in the morning as Asia wakes up to a new day. Get up to speed with major events shaping lives in the region and other parts of the world.
Putting things in perspective with eye-opening reports and expert analysis as a new era of global politics breeds power struggles and shifting alliances.
We get to the heart of the matter and take stock of the issues you're invested in with on-the-ground reports and wall-to-wall coverage. Viewing it all from a regional lens because we put Asia first.
So I'll be going to Nepal for a work exchange for 2 weeks. I do hope that the experience will bring me some sort of inspiration to kind of like guide myself into doing something with my life.
Her going on this trip this time, it's a calling for her as well because she always loved to help.
And just to see like a different perspective in life that's like outside of Singaporean, typical perspective.
I recently left my job. I think the burnout comes from institutional challenges and also personal challenges.
I just bought an Aki. We have to make it work. If not, I have to start selling off all the assets and I go back to Singapore.
MediaCorp has been honored as Broadcaster of the Year at the 2025 World Media Festival. From Singapore to the world, our gripping documentaries and unforgettable entertainment continue to inspire, captivate, and connect audiences across the globe. This award celebrates the passion and talent behind every story we tell. Watch the award-winning programs on demand for free on MeWatch.
The World Economic Forum in Tianjin, China, wrapping up day 2. And Chinese Premier Li Qiang has urged countries to support multilateralism in the face of rising trade protectionism. For more, Olivia Seong once again joins us live from the forum. So, Ollie, tell us more about the discussions that the participants have been having on the Chinese economy.
That's right. We heard from the Chinese premier, as you mentioned, they're expressing confidence in China's economic trajectory, also warning all sides not to turn trade into a security or political issue. Even though he didn't mention it, we know that the context in which this event is taking place under are those sweeping global tariffs by the U.S. Trump administration. And earlier, I spoke to Eswar Prasad, who is professor at Cornell University, and he told me how all this industrial policy coupled with the ongoing conflict in the Middle East is adding to the uncertainty in the global economy for the long term. And the narratives have been shifting greatly, and the news also, he also spoke to me about what this means for the Chinese economy.
In Washington, it's very hard to predict where policies will go. I strongly suspect that we're going to end up with U.S. tariffs being higher than they were before the Trump era, and I suspect there are going to be tariffs perhaps at a level of about 10%, plus or minus a few percentage points, on practically every major U.S. trading partner, with the possible exceptions of Canada and Mexico. And I also strongly suspect that the tariff level on imports from China is going to be significantly higher. It could end up in the range of 25 to 30%, depending on how the negotiations go. Now, that is a tariff level that is certainly quite high, but it's a tariff level that if businesses know is going to persist for a while, they can plan around it, they can work around it. And one of the reasons I think we will end up with some significant tariffs on the US side is that it is turning out to be a significant source of revenue.
And that would be a fundamental shift rather than a temporary thing, regardless of the administration in power.
It looks like we are moving to a world where every country is going to put up some protectionist barriers. And it's worth keeping in mind that there is a very curious conjuncture right now. On the one hand, you have the largest economy in the world trying to block trade through the imposition of tariffs. On the other side, you have the second largest economy in the world, China. There is a huge amount of excess capacity that has accumulated in its economy, and that excess capacity continues to increase. So China needs export markets. And given China's size, this is a frightening prospect for the rest of the world. There are many commodity exporters that are, of course, happy that China is continuing to grow. But if you look at major economies like Japan, Germany, which are very reliant on exports for their own growth and are not doing that well right now, they're quite terrified about being flooded by Chinese exports. So the reality is that every country around the world is going into somewhat defensive mode. And defensive mode essentially means putting up their own barriers to trade. So they would like freer trade with the US, but they're concerned about freeing up trade with China. So they're really caught in an uncomfortable situation, and unfortunately, what this portends, I think, is greater barriers to trade around the world.
What does that mean for the Chinese economy? What is your assessment of the effectiveness of these stimulus measures at this point in time?
They certainly seem to have worked despite all the uncertainty created by tariffs and the geopolitical environment. On the surface, the Chinese economy seems to be in pretty decent shape. I think Chinese leaders and also Chinese people in general seem to have accepted that the very high growth rates of the past are not going to come back. But I think the real concern about China is the deeper problems are not being addressed. The housing market continues to unravel. The financial system still has a lot of weaknesses. Not anything that will precipitate a crisis, but the financial system is not doing a great job at allocating capital. I spoke about investment doing well. It's not private investment that's growing. It's state-led investment that is growing a lot, and it's not clear that is very efficient. Local governments are under stress. So if you put these deeper problems together, it suggests that China is going to have a difficult time even maintaining 5% growth. But one might argue that what President Xi Jinping and his cabinet are doing is saving the stimulus because there might be further trouble down the road, either from external sources or from domestic sources. But I certainly wish the Chinese government would use this opportunity of relative calm to start tackling the more fundamental problems that are affecting the Chinese economy.
What is the message that businesses or investors want to hear?
What I think is needed is really much more fiscal support, not just in the form of temporary transfers or income support, but a reorientation of the tax system so that local governments are not under so much pressure, and also you can start seeing reductions in income taxes applied to both corporations as well as households. I think those are the sorts of measures that are really necessary in order to get the economy going. But the fundamental issue really is one of confidence still, and that's why I think monetary policy won't have great traction, because when households are not very confident about future economic prospects, when private businesses are not sure about how the government is going to view them, then households don't consume, private businesses don't invest. And fixing that confidence problem with a broader set of reforms that I think are necessary on the labor market front, on the fiscal front, measures to tackle the housing market in a more fundamental way, that I think is really necessary. But all of that needs to be layered with a clear signal from the government that it is going to support private enterprise rather than be hostile towards it. It's good that President Xi Jinping had a meeting with major entrepreneurs. That has helped to turn around sentiment a little bit, but I think more concrete actions will be needed.
And this comes as we heard the Chinese premier today also say that China's expansion is not short-term, but that its goals are long-term ones. And this comes as the country is expected to release its next 5-year plan, which begins next year, and will be looking out for whether it actually does address some of these longer-term structural issues that economists are talking about. Atelli.
Hey, thanks so much for that. Olivia Seong reporting to us live from the World Economic Forum in Tianjin, China. Now, the rapid rollout of artificial intelligence is raising tough questions at the World Economic Forum as industry leaders map out the future of AI. Its adoption has been expanding to more parts of daily life, from factories to hospitals, as Lauren Ong finds out.
And more immune. Application, application, application. That's the resounding focus at the World Economic Forum as leaders move beyond theory towards real-world implementation of AI. It comes at a pivotal moment in the AI wave, with breakthroughs like DeepSeek making AI faster, cheaper, and smaller, pushing it closer to widespread real-world use.
What changes have brought by DeepSeek, I think, is to lower the threshold of using AI. Threshold, I mean the financial threshold, investment. Threshold means the energy consumption threshold. If we talk about the AI adoption, we need experts, have some expertise to integrate AI technology as a general purpose technology.
The discussion around AI is multifaceted. It's about making it part of our daily lives, aside from standalone tools like ChatGPT or DeepSeek. Take these robotic fingers, for example. They use AI to feel textures and understand gestures. They can help with surgery or even one day provide advanced prosthetics to those who need them. AI is seemingly everywhere, in the autonomous driving features of cars, in factories, in phones, but challenges remain. Despite falling costs, the widespread adoption of AI systems across industries has yet to take place. According to a recent report by the World Economic Forum, less than half of chief economists expect AI to become commercially disruptive this year. One major roadblock is the shortage of workers equipped with the skills to work with AI, not just use it. There's also a broader geopolitical picture. Restrictions on advanced chips, especially from the US, have further complicated progress in China, slowing down access to the kinds of AI hardware needed to train cutting-edge models.
I think in the sort of global landscape, and certainly in Asia Pacific, there's a lot of regulatory hurdles. So we recently did a survey of a large number of our clients, and we had over 80% of executives cite a lack of regulation or regulation lagging the industry as an impediment to some of the investments. So we certainly think organisations need to consider the regulatory environment that they're operating in as well.
But industry leaders say this creates ground for innovation.
If politics gets into the way, engineers and developers will find a different way to solve the problem. I think that's actually really good for the field. We're going to get different ideas, inspiring, the different ecosystems, and I think competition is actually always healthy and is going to produce better results faster.
Some experts also say the race for AI supremacy is not just a zero-sum game.
I do see China and the US are very different competitive strengths, right? I mean, so if we combine these two countries together, they will make a perfect team because the skill sets are complementary, right? I mean, so in reality, right? I mean, people talking about, oh, we need to achieve AI supremacy in order to secure data security, in order to secure national security, in order to achieve economic growth. I don't think that's the case, right? Everybody is trying to advance, and it's not necessarily that you have to get to the most cutting edge that you can create that explosive growth.
Despite the challenges, industry leaders believe more unexpected moments, such as the emergence of DeepSeek, could still be on the horizon. They add that the key lies in reimagining AI's role, allowing it to take over certain tasks, while humans concentrate on areas where they excel. Lauren Ong, CNA, Tianjin, China.
As promised, Roland Lim is back here again to give us more business news. What do you have for us?
Yep, can't keep me away, Otelli. Shares of gaming firms NetEase, Tencent ending the day in the green after China's gaming regulator approved some 158 publishing licenses in June. This is the largest number of approvals this year. NetEase's shares rose as much as 1.6% before losing some steam. Tencent shares also relatively muted, rising by as much as 0.6%. The National Press and Public Administration says it granted over 100 new gaming licenses to the likes of Tencent, Baidu, NetEase and ByteDance, including a dozen imported games. Shares of the gaming developers had taken a beating when Beijing enacted an 18-month freeze on gaming licenses approvals until early 2022. Since then, the number of licenses has been on a steady rise. Shares of some Asian carriers have gained ground as air travel disruptions started to ease in the Middle East. Regional carriers have resumed regular service, with operations restarting at some of the world's busiest airports. Air tracking data from FlightAware showed 243 cancellations worldwide as of Tuesday morning, with Dubai International Airport topping the list. More than a dozen airlines had cancelled or rerouted flights to parts of the region, with travelers on board a Paris-bound Qantas flight spending more than 15 hours in the air, only to find themselves back where they started, in Australia. India said that it was stopping all operations to the Middle East and flights to North America's East Coast and Europe. Japan Airlines halted services to Doha until Friday. The loyal Vietnamese property tycoon Trong My Lan says that his client will no longer face execution after Hanoi abolished the death penalty for 8 crimes, including property embezzlement. Lan was sentenced to death for fraud totaling some $27 billion, but her lawyer says that the penalty will now be converted to life in prison. Lan was convicted last year of swindling money from the Saigon Commercial Bank, which prosecutors argue she had control over. The property tycoon owned just 5% of shares in SCB, but courts concluded that she effectively controlled more than 90% through family, friends and staff. The $27 billion fraud she was convicted of was equivalent to around 6% of Vietnam's entire GDP. Vietnam abolished the death penalty for 8 crimes today, among them espionage, graft, and attempting to overthrow the government. And that's it for business, for real. Otelli.
Till tomorrow. Thanks so very much, Roland. On that note, that does it for East Asia tonight, this Wednesday. Hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget your headlines anytime at cna.asia. Thanks for watching.
The weather brought to you by Trafalgar.